Assalamu alaikum everyone to the fourth session of Ask Dr. Saleem series, where you can ask any questions related to Islam in Urdu or English, your preference of language. However, because this series is meant to be in English to reach a wider array of audiences, the answers will be primarily given in English. To ask a question, you'll have to raise your hand with the raise hand button, and that's going to place you in a queue where your questions will be taken in the order that they're received in. We already have a few written questions, so those will be taken before we take the questions from the participants raising their hands currently. And so once your name is called and you've asked your questions, I would request you to please mute your microphone to prevent any feedback from the noise. If you want to clarify your question further or, add on to it a bit once Dr. Saleem is done answering, you may unmute yourself and add that bit. But please remember to mute yourself again, just so that we have a clearer recording. And so with that, we'll begin with our first question that asks, can you please explain the concept of why Zohar and Asr are read silently in Jama'ah and Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha are read loudly in Jama'ah? Thank you.
As far as this question is concerned, we do not find any answer to this in our sources or the Sunnah or any of the Hadiths that we know. They don't actually comment on this, and this is more related to God's hikmah or His wisdom, because as far as ordaining the prayer is concerned and making it a very important worship ritual to be undertaken is something which God Himself has prescribed, and it actually is an expression of our relationship with Him. So this is much like the question that if anyone asks me that why is it that there are 5 prayers, and why is it that we pray at these 5 particular times, or why is it that we just pray 2 rakats of Fajr and why not 4 of them, and why do we pray 3 for Maghrib, etc. So you see, these are a bunch of questions which relate to the wisdom of God, and there has to be some wisdom behind them, because as far as our relationship with God is concerned, it depends heavily on how we relate ourselves to God. And the precepts of this relationship, we cannot discover ourselves. For example, we would never be able to know that in order to have an optimum relationship with our Creator, we need to fast for 30 days and not 15 or not 45 days. Or that the charity that we need to give is 2.5% on wealth and 5% or 10% on our income. So this is an area which specifically in which the Almighty Himself has come down to us and given His verdict. All that we can say is that there is some hikmah or some wisdom behind it. And I think one of the things that come to my mind is, and of course people or some other people or some other minds would differ with it, because here, the wisdom of God is something that we would ourselves be trying to determine. And it's not necessary that we reach the right wisdom, because God Himself has not chosen to reveal this wisdom behind the silence of the Zohar and Asr prayer. So probably what we can relate to, or what comes to my mind, is that in a natural environment in which day and night are divided in a way in which Arabs used to divide it in those times, in which nightfall was the end of activity, and the dawn would be the beginning of activities, which was much different to what we are used to today. So it's not that at nightfall we end our activities. In fact, we accelerate them. So the environment and the culture that we are generally used to is slowly turning into a night culture, in which nightlife is a life on its own self. It's like an independent thing. But coming back to the question that why is it that in the natural sequence of events, when nightfall signaled the end of activity of a day, what would be the reason that the day prayers or the Zohar or Asr prayer, which of course they come right at the time when people are about to disperse from their work and go back, I would say that this is a time of hustle, bustle, and activity. In those times, or in areas in which Isha or the last prayer would signal that this is the end of our daily activity. So in those cultures or in those societies which still follow this timeline, it is the Zohar and Asr prayer which signal that people are now going to end their work and now they are going to leave for their homes to finally have their dinner and then, of course, go to bed. So this is a time which is a lot of there's a lot of hustle and bustle going on. So perhaps this is the reason that the prayer was deemed to be silent. But on the contrary, the Fajr and the Maghrib times, they are times of peace. They are the times in which when we are naturally inclined towards that natural phenomena in which Fajr or beginning of day would be signaled by the dawn of the or by the beginning of the Fajr prayer, and Isha would signal the end of the Fajr of the daily routine. So I would say that because of the fact that these are days of peaceful, or these are times of rather peaceful activities, so therefore the prayer that we do in these times is read out loud. So this is what comes to my mind. But as I said, the real wisdom God Himself knows. He never chose to reveal it, and so as human beings, we would try to understand this, and this is the understanding that I at the moment prefer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem, for the detailed answer. The next question asks, the participant would like to know if the following ayah, which is from Surah Anaam, ayah 116, commands Muslims not to trust the judgment of the majority of people in all matters. So the ayah reads, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّونَكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ إِنْ يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنْ هُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ.
No, actually, this is not the case. This is not that you have to don't trust. I mean, this has a particular context, and the context is that in Tutaya Aksara Manfil is actually referring to the fact that in this land of Arabia, in which most people are idolaters, if you start worshipping them, then they will lead you astray. So this has a very particular context, and it says that you must not follow these idolaters, and if you start following them, you yourself would be led astray. So it has a very specific nuance to it, and it cannot be generalized in the manner you have just asked.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. And then, so the next question is divided into three parts, where the first part asks, is Qurbani a fard for women? And so if there is a limit for the income of an individual or a family, could the amount that's being used for the Qurbani be used to pay for the needy instead of keeping the Qurbani portions to ourselves, the family, and the poor?
So the Qurbani or animal sacrifice is not a farz at all, neither for women and nor for men. And this is a common misconception. And the reason that it has arisen is that the Hanafite jurists, or the jurists which are generally followed in the Indo-Pak subcontinent and some other areas, this is what they believe. Otherwise, if you study the sources, you'll find that Qurbani on the time of Eid is absolutely an optional act of worship, and it is entirely left to the discretion of the person. It is highly recommended because it has a very deep philosophy. And if you understand that philosophy, you realize that this is a very grand worship ritual, but it is not a farz or obligatory in any way. People can combine, a whole society can combine, a town can combine and give one single animal sacrifice, especially keeping in view the general hygienic conditions of people that have arisen in modern times, in which we are no longer living in a nomadic culture or a rural culture in which urbanization is the name that we all follow. And in this urbanization, of course, cleanliness and hygiene and a lot of other things, they are essential to maintain. So in such circumstances, you have to understand that primarily animal sacrifice is a symbolic expression of the fact that there can be times in our life when we have to spend our lives for the cause of truth. Maybe, for example, trying to save someone, or trying to do acts in which we are able to give our life and save several other lives. So this might never arise in our lifetime, but there is always a chance that instances might arise in which we need to give our own lives to save people or do some great deed. So in order to rehearse ourselves of this, the Almighty wants us to sacrifice an animal every year. As I said, it's recommended, it's not first, that when we sacrifice that animal, we are making this commitment to God that today we are sacrificing this animal before you, and making this commitment that if tomorrow my own life is needed for a just cause, I will not abstain, I will not withhold myself. So therefore, it's my personal commitment to you that I will come forward and give my life if the need be. And for this, this is a token, this is a symbol that I am sacrificing this lamb or this cattle or this animal, this camel, whatever the animal is being sacrificed. That this is my commitment. So basically, animal sacrifice is not for the distribution of the meat of the animal as is generally understood. That's just a byproduct. So the real thing is the intention that you are doing this, that tomorrow if my life is needed, I will not withhold myself. And for this, today, I'm sacrificing an animal and giving you my firm commitment that this is basically my token of expression that tomorrow I'll be available if that need arises. So when the animal is slaughtered, of course, as far as the meat itself is concerned, it can be used for any purpose. You can eat it yourself. You can distribute it among your friends or among the poor. But remember, distribution of meat is just a byproduct of this whole ritual. It's just a secondary thing. It's not the main thing. And that is why people generally think, well, why not we pay money in charity instead of distributing meat? Because people don't need meat at this time, and maybe charity money is more needed. So again, the misconception is because charity is being equated with distribution of meat, which is never the intention of sacrifice or animal sacrifice. As I said, the real intention is that you are making this commitment to God. So I think if you are able to gauge this philosophy behind animal sacrifice, it is bound to inspire all of us that yes, we will inshallah try our best to make the sacrifice or slaughter an animal for this purpose. But because of the fact that it's not an obligatory thing, and because of the fact that there is a lot of things which are involved with animal sacrifice, so we'll jointly do that, and this joint animal sacrifice would be witnessed by us so that we can see that the blood which is flowing right in front of our eyes is basically a symbolism of the fact that tomorrow if my life is needed, I'll be there for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. So for one part of the question, it asks, is there a limit for the income of an individual or the family?
Well, you see, when it is not optional, when it's not obligatory, when it is optional, this question should not arise. It is not related to your income, whether you have low income or high income or this income or that income. It is if you can afford an animal, and that too, if you are able to do it. So, this question had arisen or should have arisen if people wanted to know that what exactly is the amount that I earn, which makes me liable for animal sacrifice.
See, thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. And then the last written question that is in relation to the ISC session today asks, authentic soft attitude is the result of humility and humbleness of the heart. So how can we have this humbleness?
So you see, humility is another thing which comes to, or should come to us naturally, because if we realize that we are the creation of a creator who is all powerful, and he can take away any of our talents, any of our gifts, or our wealth or affluence, or all that we possess in the blink of an eye. And he today in the last 2 years has made himself shown to us that this very small virus, which is not even alive, that has governed a better part of our lives in the last 2 years, and thereby making this whole premise even more powerful, that if God wants, he can really make his presence felt. So basically, it is like acknowledging the fact that we are weak individuals, and therefore this is something which is absolutely true, weak in front of the power of God. And we have been made by a creator who is all powerful, and at the same time we have our weaknesses, we have our shortcomings. So if we keep an eye on our shortcomings, it keeps us humble, because once you realize that you have these shortcomings, you will not be able to boast yourself about these shortcomings. They are nothing to boast about. In fact, they are something to hide from others. And this, in other words, gives us this feeling that we should be humble. And then another thing is that we often make mistakes. And this mistake history, if you keep that in mind, will make you further humble, that never utter things or words which you are so definitive that you think that you are the last word on that subject, because many a time we make this claim, and many a time we have to take it back, because better opinions come forward and defeat the previous opinion. So this is a lesson that we keep on learning in life, that as we go through life, opinions change, opinions are they are overruled, which tell us that, well, we must not think that we are the final word in so many other things. And so another thing which might help is that we always look at things that we have as a trust of God, something that God has given us and which He can take from us at any time. And also the fact that we were never entitled to these favors that we have. There's so many things that we possess and we never earn them. And God is going to, I mean, he has the ability to take them away whenever He would like to. And this has happened in so many cases right before our eyes. So it's just a question of keeping our eyes open. And last but not the least, a small thing that I always stress or maybe point out to keep us humble is try to be the first person to greet others and stick out your hand if you're able to greet others. Then don't wait for others, especially if they are junior to you or younger to you in age or in status or in position in your organization. So don't wait for other people to start the salutation. Be the first one to greet the other person, because it's difficult to be the first one because one's own esteem gets in one's way. So if we are able to overcome that esteem and be the first ones to break the ice, this is another thing that helps us in keeping humble. And there are so many other ways, I would say, but these are some of the ones that come to my mind at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Our next question comes from Rafia Khwaja. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saleem. I'm sorry I've been missing your classes because I've been traveling in America. My question is that I'm attending these interfaith dialogues, and I heard once that when you're talking to the non-Muslims, you should present the Quran to them and ask them to read it. My question is that do I present the Quran if just like that, or do I present it if a Christian or Jew says he's interested in reading the Quran? Because
well, I think this is I don't understand, and this is the wisdom that each one of us should exercise while we're dealing with our brothers and sisters of other faiths. It all depends on what the need is, where the conversation is going, what is the background of a person, whether he's highly educated or just a beginner in religion. There's so many possibilities. So I think it's just a question of exercising that wisdom on that occasion, that where exactly is my audience coming from and where exactly is he or she standing. And I think that is the best guide. But yes, giving the Quran in a translation form is one of the good ways. And I think that even before you give the Quran, perhaps it is good to actually give a short booklet on which introduces the Quran to them. So this is something which would be even more worthwhile, that you give the Quran and a short introduction to the Quran so that they can read that introduction and then read the Quran.
Yes, you have published a booklet, Introduction to the Quran. So I think that would be better rather than suddenly giving something which they may not be inclined immediately. So I understand it. Thank you so much for your help. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Noshad Shafkat. Please go ahead.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम डॉक्टर साहब। डॉक्टर साहब, मुझे ये बताइए कि ये 6 कलमे जो इस्लाम में बताए जाते हैं, इनकी हकीकत क्या है, कि क्या इसका कोई सैंक्शन है इस्लाम में, या they are just because I have heard a lot about them but somehow don't feel convinced. Could you please enlighten us on that?
There's nothing
डॉक्टर साहब, क्योंकि बहुत से लोग हैं.
So actually I have been asked to answer in English because this is to reach a wider audience. So excuse me. As far as these kalmas are concerned, they have, they are not at all prescribed by the Prophet or by the Quran or in any way by the Sahaba. These are basically, I would say, statements which people have recorded, especially the scholars of the subcontinent, in order to teach the younger lot. So they are like one-liners which give us a basic idea of some of the beliefs and practices and the attitudes that we should adopt in life. So they are basically just recommendations that you should do, nothing of the sort of an obligation. neither from the Quran nor from the Prophet. So it's even if you don't know them, there's not a problem, because as long as you are attached to the Quran, that is absolutely fine.
Our next participant is Naseem. Please go ahead.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम शहजाद भाई.
Walaikum assalam.
I will ask in Urdu and you can respond in English. So मेरा सवाल ये है, इसके दो पार्ट हैं. पहला ये कि कुरान में जैसे आल इमरान में भी इस्तेमाल हुआ है अतीउल्लाह व अतीउर रसूल, और दूसरे मकामात पर भी ये आयत आई है. तो पहला पार्ट तो उसका ये है कि वह जो इस्तेमाल हुआ है, वाव जो इस्तेमाल हुआ है वातीउल्लाह व अतीउर रसूल, ओबे अल्लाह एंड ओबे मैसेंजर. तो जो वाव आया है ये एंड के लिए इस्तेमाल हुआ है, क्योंकि बाज़ जगह वाव कसमिया भी इस्तेमाल होता है, जैसे वल असर है या वतीन है व जैतून है. तो यहाँ पे जो पर्टिकुलर स्पेसिफिकली वाव जो है वो और के लिए इस्तेमाल हुआ है बीच में, और अगर और के लिए इस्तेमाल हुआ है तो ये दो सेपरेट बात हो गई. तो इसमें मेरी कंफ्यूजन ये है कि जो रिवायती जो कॉन्सेप्ट है वो ये है कि अतीउल्लाह से तो मतलब कुरान की जो कमांडमेंट है वो हमें ओबे करना है, ओबे अल्लाह ये यहाँ हो जाएगी पूरी. और वातीउर रसूल से जो है ओबे मैसेंजर से ये मुराद होगी जो मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम ने कहा, यानी कि जो हदीस की सूरत में हमारे पास उनके बहुत सारी चीजें मौजूद हैं वो हमें ओबे करना है, तो वो अतीउर रसूल हो जाएगा. लेकिन जाहिर है कि इसके साथ एक दूसरा ओपिनियन भी मौजूद है जो कि कहता है कि हदीस हुज्जत नहीं है उसमें जो है उसकी ऑथेंटिसिटी की वजह से, जबकि वो कहते हैं कि शायद ये एक निज़ाम की बात है, जो अतीउर रसूल जो है वो एक निज़ाम है तो उसको ओबे करना है. लेकिन हमने देखा है कि दूसरी जगह वो भी आया है वह अतीउल अमर, यानी कि अपने रूलर्स को जो है फॉलो करें आप. तो इसमें आप क्या कहेंगे, क्या अंडरस्टैंडिंग आपकी, क्या अंडरस्टैंडिंग इस बारे में, तो प्लीज एलोबरेट इट. थैंक यू.
So as far as the verses are concerned, which begin by these sentences, Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul, and especially the one which is found in Surah Nisa, they actually refer to the fact that at the time of the revelation of this surah, God's rule had been established on the face of the earth through his messenger. So basically this is referring to the Hukumat Ilahiyya, or the divine rule, which was established on the face of the earth, after which of course the conclusive communication of the truth, or Atmam al-Hujjah, had taken place, and as a result of that, people were to be punished or to be rewarded depending upon the attitude that they adopted. So basically, you'll find that these verses refer to the authority of God and the Prophet on this earth when the Quran was being revealed. It has nothing to do with Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul in the meaning of that you obey the Quran and you obey the Hadith, because the Quran has been given by the Almighty and Hadith has been given by Prophet Muhammad. Because of the fact that whatever we have received, in fact, is from Prophet Muhammad. Even the Quran has not been given to us by God directly. It is the Prophet himself who has delivered the Quran on behalf of God. So basically, when we say Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul, it is referring to the fact that it is God's rule which is now established on the face of the earth in the form of the Medinan nation, or the Medinan Riyasat, which had been formed at that time. And therefore, if you are to follow this rule, you must be citizens who follow all the rules. But at the same time, this fact that Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul relates to the fact that you are to follow the Quran or the Hadith. That's something which has emerged later on, because as the authority of the Prophet and the authority of God Mighty himself is for all times to come. So for later generations, what is practically being said is that you follow the commandments of the God which are given to you through Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they were given to the Prophet on behalf of God in the form of the Quran and the Sunnah. So the Quran and the Sunnah, which was given by the Almighty to the Prophet, so it's like saying that you obey God through the Prophet. And it's not, as you said, that wow is of oath here or of qasam here, because had it been the case, we would have had a jar after the word lam. We would have the words what you rasuleh, which of course is a natural sign of the fact that the wow occurs for qasam. Here it is just for copulation, what we call as ataf, which means that you just place two things adjacent together. So practically, Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul would mean that for the rest of the generations after this rule had been established, we as Muslims are bound to follow whatever has been given by the Almighty through Prophet himself, and whatever has been given through the Prophet himself by the Almighty is the Quran and the established Sunnah. So both the Quran and the established Sunnah is what God has given to the Prophet so that we could obey it. I've slightly taken a little more descriptive form to answer your question because it has a lot of underpinnings, and people have often interpreted the word Atiullah to be that you should follow the Quran and Ati Rasul to mean that you should follow the Hadith, whereas this is not the case in my humble opinion.
सो इसकी हमारे वक्त में एक बात तो आपकी बात समझ में आ गई कि एक जो बात कही गई है वो रसूलुल्लाह के टाइम के वक्त जब एस्टैब्लिश करने मदीने की गवर्नमेंट के लिए था, ये बात के पनिशमेंट और दूसरी चीजें के लिए था। लेकिन अब ये आयत जब हम कहते हैं कि कुरान इज अ लिविंग बुक ऑल द टाइम, तो अब हमारे लिए सिग्निफिकेंस नहीं है फिर इसकी?
मैं तो I just answered this question that it has that significance because today when we follow the Quran and the Sunnah, which is established Sunnah, this is something which we have obtained from Prophet Muhammad, which is Ati Rasul. I mean, we are obeying him, and obeying him is something that we are doing because he is presenting something on behalf of God. So when we follow the Prophet himself in these two things, which is the Quran and Sunnah, we are in fact following God himself. So this is much like what the Quran itself said elsewhere, "Man yuti'i rasula faqad ata'a Allah." He who followed the Prophet is a person who followed God himself. So basically, Ati Rasul means that we follow the Quran and the Sunnah because the Quran and the Sunnah both have been given by Prophet himself. Although they originate from the Almighty, but the method or the way that they were delivered to us was through the person of the Prophet.
नहीं तो आप सुन्ना को और हदीस को वो कर रहे हैं, सेपरेट कर रहे हैं फिर, क्योंकि हदीस में तो बहुत सी ऐसी बातें जो कि सहीफ है।
What I'm saying is the Quran and the established practice of the Prophet. This is what we have obtained from this whole I would say the whole injunction in which it is said that the Quran and the Prophet himself has to follow, or God or the Prophet himself has to follow. So it's basically telling us that whatever we have obtained from these two sources has to be followed. And what we have obtained is, of course, the religion of God in the form of the Quran and the established practice of the Prophet.
So where we can find the authentic Sunnah?
From the established perpetual practical adherence of the Ummah to it. We don't need to go anywhere.
But we see a lot of differences in all Ummah in practice.
As far as the differences are concerned, they either occur in areas in which differences have been allowed by the source giver himself. Other than that, we find no difference. All of the differences that have arisen have generally arisen because in that particular area, discretion was given to us that we could either of the two, we could adopt either of the two. And we insisted on one and negated the other. So that is the reason that differences have arisen. To give you an example, that tying our hands when we are praying is something that has been left to us. So we have not been specifically ordained to tie our hands. All that we have been told is to stand with a certain etiquette before the Almighty. So if there are some people who tie their hands or cross their hands on their bellies, and there's some people who just let them or keep them dangling on their sides, let them dangle on their sides, both are equally allowed practices. But what has happened is that people who have started to tie their hands, they think that this is the only thing that they should do, and hence they would not allow the other option or the possibility. And similarly, people who don't tie their hands, they think that this is what the Prophet did, and they don't give this leverage to people who tie their hands. So the fact of the matter is that tying hands, whether you tie them or not, or what part of your body you tie them, was left to our own discretion. And this discretion, of course, could have resulted in any of these differences. So basically, it is a God-given broad discretion in which he didn't deem it necessary to make any particular line incumbent for us to follow. He had given us this discretion to follow any of the two options that we would like.
थैंक यू, जज़ाकल्लाह। इसमें थोड़ी सी मैं ऐड कर दूं कि जो मेरी अंडरस्टैंडिंग इसमें जो आई है वो ये आई कि जैसे कि हम नमाज अदा करते हैं तो हम जैसे जोहर की हम नमाज पढ़ रहे हैं तो 4 रकात फर्ज पढ़ते हैं हम, तो क्योंकि कुरान में क्योंकि स्पेसिफाई नहीं है रकात क्या या, लेकिन हम 4 पढ़ रहे हैं, ये अतीउर रसूल है, क्योंकि रसूल ने हमें ये करके दिखाया और फिर जनरेशन टू जनरेशन ये ट्रांसमिट हुआ इस तरीके से, तो हम इसको इस तरह से हम रसूल अतीउल रसूल हम कर रहे हैं. ये क्या ये अंडरस्टैंडिंग?
This is the partial understanding. It is also correct, but what I would say is that the Quran also is Atiur Rasul. You're following the Prophet because you see, we have received the Quran and the Sunnah from the person of the Prophet. So the Almighty is the person or the being who has given or who has originated the Quran. But as far as we are concerned, for all practical purposes, the Quran has been received by us from the Prophet. So even by following the Quran or by acting upon the precepts of the Quran, we are in fact doing Atiur Rasul. So it's not that Atiur Rasul is different from anything than Atiullah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Our next question asks, in verse 20 from Surah Namal, it says, he inspected the birds and said, what is the matter that I do not see the hawpo, or is he among the absentees? I will surely punish him with a severe torment or slaughter him unless he brings me a clear reason. So the question is, why was Sulaiman a.s. so harsh to a benign bird with no consciousness, who just flew from one place to another with no purpose? Wasn't his response a bit too harsh?
Well, the harshness can be understood if we are able to gauge the particular situation in which Solomon or the Prophet Solomon was given his responsibility. So inspecting his army and imposing a certain discipline is something which is always part of our own culture, and in particular in those times when standing armies of human beings as well as of the birds and of other animals which were at the disposal of Prophet Solomon had to be there in order to circumvent any enemy attack. And it was considered as high treason that if a person, for a certain, without any reason or without informing people or their person who's organizing them, was away and not present. So of course, had the hudhud or this bird had some reason which was absolutely logical, and which when he came back he did present, of course Solomon would never have done so. But any laziness or indifference actually amounted to the fact that you are showing indifference to your duty, which would have resulted in any sort of problem, I would say, if an enemy had attacked, and it could have caused a lot of disruption. So it was the requisite of discipline that if there was a parade going on, if there was an inspection going on, and that inspection required the presence of every single individual, whether animal or human, to be there. And if without any reason that particular being was not there, then it was the requisite of justice that he should be punished. Also remember that he said that I would slaughter him. This means that if he has no legitimate excuse, or he's sick maybe, or maybe he's away, of course this would not entail that the Solomon would do so. So this was an expression of his last intent, that if he is away and he is indifferent to his responsibility and to his duty, as a result of which some great loss could be suffered, then if that happens, then he would be put to death. So this is like stating the extreme last punishment, and telling us that if the person who is responsible for this doesn't have any legitimate excuse, then this is his punishment. So this was the last, I would say, the ultimate punishment which he could possibly give. It doesn't mean that he had decided to give this. For all intents and purposes, if something else had happened, for example, if you would have come and said that I've fallen sick, or that I forgot the time, or whatever, I'm sure some accommodation would have been made for that. So I think we have to understand that this is an expression of extreme punishment, which does express an intent, but it does not necessarily entail that that intent would be translated into action as well. It was just an option that he could use for an extreme case of high treason.
Thank you very much for the clarification, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, is it allowable to eat from Ahlul Kitab even when it's not a zabihah?
It is not. To be a zabiah is essential, which means that the animal has to be slaughtered in a way that the name of God has been taken at the time of slaughter, and of course that all the blood has been drained out, which are the two conditions for a zabiah to be halal. So for the people of the book, it was said that their zabiah is halal because in those times they followed both these conditions. So they slaughtered an animal by taking God's name, and they also drained out all the blood. So if they started to deviate from these conditions, which they did not in those earlier times, it obviously would mean that you would not eat such food.
Dr. Saleem, could you please clarify what about rennet that comes from the stomachs of young animals?
So you see, we need to understand that rennet or some of the other things, they are basically enzymes which help in digestion. And if they change their chemical composition, then of course the directive no longer applies to them. And in my understanding, they do change their composition when they are cooked, maybe, or they are used in certain items. So I think it's basically the reason that we need to understand that if there is something in which the chemical composition of that thing changes, then it no longer remains the thing which was prohibited. This is one thing that I'd like to say. And the second thing is, the Almighty has said that things which are edible are prohibited. So edible things are, for example, fat of an animal, the flesh of the animal, or some of the parts, the bones that you can chew. But I don't think that enzymes can be classified as edibles in the first place. So even if the chemical composition doesn't change, I would say that rennet is something, if it is found even without any chemical change, it should not be something to be any cause of concern.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. We have a couple more written questions, but before we move on to them, Naseem, please go ahead.
जी शहजाद भाई, आपके इसी से जो अभी आपने जवाब दिया है इसमें जबिया के बारे में, मैं यहाँ कनाडा में रहता हूँ और ज़ाहिर मैंने तो अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह स्ट्रिक्ट किया हुआ है जबिया के ऊपर, लेकिन यहाँ पे अरब स्कॉलर्स है जिन्होंने इस पे फतवा दिया, और अरब जो लोग हैं बड़े कॉमनली यहाँ पे कहते हैं कि बीफ इज हलाल एंड चिकन इज हलाल. In Quran there is no forbidden about that, no provision that, so why we don't eat this one. एंड कुछ अरब स्कॉलर्स ने ये बात कही थी. डॉक्टर जमाल बदवी हमारे यहाँ के बहुत बड़े स्कॉलर हैं यहाँ पे हैलिफैक्स कनाडा में, मैंने उनसे भी पूछा था ये बात कि आपने ये बात, उन्होंने कहा कि मैंने उस वक्त ये कही थी कि अगर टाउन में आपके पास उसमें कोई अवेलेबल नहीं है हलाल जबिया तो आप ये खा सकते हैं. तो मैंने कहा कि तो वो तो वेजिटेबल भी खा सकते हैं, फिर ना खाए, ये क्या जरूरत है. तो ये यहाँ पे बड़ा कॉमन है जो कि मुसलमान अरब हैं वो इजीली खाते हैं, कहते हैं नहीं ये हराम नहीं. आप क्या कहते हैं इसके बारे?
जी मुझे मालूम है, I do know that some of the Shafi'ite jurists who follow Imam Shafi, they have this verdict, but I don't agree with it, unfortunately. And I think that the Quran is absolutely explicit that the reason that the food of the people of the book had been allowed in the time of the Prophet was that they had now come back to their original format of eating, or the laws of diet, the dietary law that they used to follow, and that was that they slaughtered that animal in a way that the name of God was taken and also the blood was drained out of it. So I think that if that condition meets, only then you can eat food from the people of the book, especially if it is meat. Otherwise, you should abstain from it. And I think that the Quran is absolutely clear about that. But yes, I know that Imam Shafi and some of the opinions that are handed down from him, they do say that if you just say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim and eat the animal, and that would be sufficient. Or there are some other details as well. But I think that this would not be in accordance with the Quran, and the Quran has explicitly said that slaughtering an animal and taking God's name at the time of slaughter, and slaughtering the animal in a way that all the blood is drained out from its veins, both these are essential conditions for consumption of meat.
Okay, thank you, Jazakallah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, it is shown as a miracle that adhan could extinguish raging fires. So there are countless videos that are shared on these incidents as miracles. So what is, the participant is asking, what does the adhan have to do with stopping fires? Is there a hadith about it? Because during COVID, they remember that some people were saying the adhan to counter COVID and presenting it as a riwayah. What's your understanding of this whole situation? I
have not seen any such riwayah or any such hadith which say that azan is something which can stop fires from blowing or whatever. I don't know how they have come to this. In my own study, haven't seen a single narrative of this sort. So people who do say so, they should present this. And another thing is that they should also realize that how flimsy this report could be, but because there are so many fires which are not extinguished by any azan. If by coincidence some of the fires got extinguished because of an azan, I think the reason for that should be found outside of the azan. It may be because of something else that might have happened, any chemical change, or maybe the wind, or maybe water somewhere that we could not detect. But merely thinking that azan is going to extinguish a fire is something which neither the Quran or any authentic hadith has ever said that azan has such a power. So I think that the litmus test would be that there are many cases in which azan is said, and in spite of that, the fires still rage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Adil, you're up next. Please go ahead.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Sahab. Hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, I can.
So, Dr. Sahab, I have two questions. I think let's start with the easier one first. In the namaz, there is this concept of sajdah sahav, which, as I understand, I think the tradition is that there are some things that are farz in namaz, and then there are some things which are regarded as wajib in namaz. There are about, I think, 17 of those, and if you miss any one of those wajibs, then you can accommodate that by doing sajdah sahav in the last rakah. Is this your understanding as well? Because it looks like the Farahi school seems to have boiled down the prayer to some very basic, like 4 or 5 key things. Is there a concept of farz and wajib and sajda sahav, as per your understanding?
I think this concept of farz, wajib, or things that we offer in the namaz when we forget, they are estimations which have been made by our jurists, and they think that there are certain things, if we don't observe them, then a sajda would be incumbent upon us, and if they are done in a certain way, then something less than that would be also acceptable. So these are all man-made or juristic things which have been formulated. The Prophet has never said anything like this, and it's basically a human construct in which our scholars have gone and enumerated what they think is farz or wajib or not. I think a more simpler approach should be adopted because it's so complicated that it will only confuse the common man. And I do adopt the approach which has been outlined by our own teacher, Ustaz Javed and Ghamidi, who in his own study of all these hadiths has come up to this conclusion that as far as any error that you make or a mistake that you make in the prayer, if it can be made up, if you can somehow in any way do it again or observe it again, then that should be done. And in the last rakat, you can offer prostration, which is a prostration done in lieu of a mistake. That is what is called sajdah sahav, and that should suffice. And if that mistake cannot be somehow made up for, then just a prostration or 2 prostrations of sahav should be done. So the answer would be that you either do just those 2 prostrations near the end of the prayer, or you do them as well as anything that you can do to make up what you missed. And to make up what you missed is concerned, again, this is a matter of human ijtihad, in which a person can see, for example, if he has just said 2 rakats and he realizes that he should have said 4, and he has done 2 rakats. So what he can do is he can just stand up again and offer the remaining 2 rakats. So this is like making up for the missed part. And so you've made up for the missed part, and now that you need to do is that you just need to offer those 2 prostrations in the last rakat, which of course would also signify the fact that you are atoning for a mistake that you do. So atoning for a mistake that you do is something that you should do either by making up that mistake if it is possible, or if it is not possible to make up that mistake, then you just atone for it by offering prostrations of sahav.
Right, and what would be an example of something that I can't make up for? For example, if I forget to, yeah, please go on.
Well, for example, it could be the fact that you forgot to say Surah Fatiha in a certain rakat, and you realize that you suddenly realize that you didn't say it, and of course this is something that you cannot do again because you just cannot offer that rakat by disrupting the sequence of the prayer. So if you have to disrupt the sequence of the prayer, that would mean that you are not able to make up. So making up actually means that you are able to at the same time maintain the sequence of the prayer and do what you can do to atone for it. So the example in which I gave you, that you had to read 4 rakats, but you ended up reading 2 of them. So when you add 2 more, you're not disrupting the sequence because these 2 more had to be said anyway. So this is one example in which the sequence is not changed or challenged, and you can just add that thing that you missed, and then you offer those prostrations. And another thing that you need to understand is that a lot of things are left to your own subjectivity. I mean, there are so many instances which are so peculiar to people, and it's like a spot of the moment decision that you take. So the spot of the moment decision could be wrong as well. So what you do is that you exercise your best judgment, and if you think that without disrupting the sequence you can make up for the mistake, you do so, and at the same time also offer the prostration. And if you think that the sequence would somehow be disrupted, you just go for the prostration in the last rakat. So I think that instead of regimenting or maybe making a list of these things, it's much better to leave ourselves to a decision right at the time when we make that mistake.
Right. So my second question is basically I've been trying to discuss this with a family member of mine. My understanding or my perception after watching Ghamidi Saab's arguments is that it's not absolutely essential for my family member for her to cover her head. I mean, if she wants to do that, she should go ahead and do that. It's not absolutely a requirement of religion of Islam to be able to do that. She has shared an argument that actually finds its source within the Arabic language in the text in the word itself. So I thought this has enough merit that I can try to present it to you as best as I can, and if you could then share your comments over it. So that argument says that in Surah Nur, ayah 31, where it is mentioned, بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, the word khimar is actually so there are many words that are used in Arabic to cover something. It's mikna, bikhfa, as well as khimar. And the word khimar specially means to cover their head. They even argued that the word khimar, which is basically alcohol, sharab, since it messes up your head, it literally just covers your head. You take away your reasoning and all when you take alcohol. So this is why the word khimar is even used for alcohol. So literally covering of head, and they even give an example of the classical Arabic poets that they used to refer to a horse which had a different color of their head from their body. They used to call that horse as muhtamir, which also has this origin from the word khamar. So they say that actually ala jubihinna, covering their bosoms, covering their satar, is obviously mentioned, but the word khamar itself has an implied meaning that it is supposed to be covering your head already. So this is why a head cover is mandated by Quran as per this ayah.
Yes, I know this argument is a very, it's a very old argument which is given by people. But what you need to realize is that the head covering is not always worn on the head. I mean, for a head covering to be on the head is not a necessity. It starts off by saying that yes, it's a head covering, but many a time people are not wearing it on their head. For example, at times the head covering or the dupatta, as you would say, or the shawl, is just dangling on your neck or maybe on your sides. So if it is something that your head had to be covered, then the Quranic word should have been explicit, and it should have said something like this: that وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ وَعَلَى رُؤُوسِهِنَّ. So they should cover their head coverings. They should use their head coverings to cover their chests or their necklines as well as their own heads. So ala ru'usihinna, which ru'us means head, this expression should have been there, because as I said, when you say that you use your head covering to cover your chest or your neckline, it doesn't necessarily apply that people are always covering their head. As I said, that head covering, which starts off as a head covering, it's not necessary that people are always covering their head. At times, that head covering is just lying vacant in a cupboard, or that head covering is just carried by you on your shoulders, or in any other way. So, if the head covering had to be of a compulsory nature, then the word should have been that يَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ وَعَلَى رُؤُوسِهِنَّ, that you use your head covers to cover your chest and all your heads. Otherwise, as you said, head covering, merely a cloth being used for a head covering is not reason enough to regard the fact that heads were already being covered. Because, as I said, head covering in itself is something in which heads are not always covered. I mean, you're not always using the head covering as a covering. There are so many instances in which head covering is just used to be carried on your shoulders or on your sides. So, to be a specific command, words had of this effect, ala ruusihinna, needed to be present. And by the way, what I also recommend you to understand is that all our classical scholars do not extract the head covering from this verse, because they also know that in the absence of ala ruusihinna, it cannot apply that head covering is compulsory. On the contrary, they use the verses of Surah Azhab, which says, Yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna, that you let your covering dangle on your heads in front of you, which they actually use for head covering. So even the classical scholars, they don't use as a proof to cover your hair or your head hair. They also use the verse of Surah Azhab, which says Yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna. So this might also.
But Surah Azhab verses were specific to the wives of Prophet anyway, right? Weren't they? Or
no, it's not necessary. Any the words of Surah Azhab are meant for Ya Nisa'il Mu'mineen as well. That when you go out, it says that, oh household of the Prophet, or women of the household of the Prophet, and women of believers, when you go out, you yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna, you let your outer cloth dangle in front of you, so that these hypocrites, they are able to recognize you, and they are not able to tease you in any way, and they are not able to harm you. So if you pick up that verse of the Quran, you'll find that it is addressing the wives of the Prophet as well as general Muslim women also.
right, I remember now. Yeah. So, but that was here. The argument is that that was sort of a one-time recommended strategy to avoid a bad situation.
No,
that
you see, that is something. This is something which is the interpretation of the Farahi school, and you must not mix the two. As far as the traditional scholars are concerned, for them, Surah Azhab is a permanent directive. So what it says is it's not something temporary. It is not something which was meant for those times. They think that it is an eternal directive. And head covering is basically derived from Surah Azhab.
Right, sir.
Not only the head covering, but the veil as well. So, Yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna to them means that they have to cover their heads and also part of their face.
If someone is propagating what he dislikes about the Prophet or Islam, does that count as fasad fil ard?
Someone is propagating what?
What they dislike about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam or about Islam? Would that
I think
count
we
as
need something. We would need something more specific. If what they are propagating is not, I mean, they're merely a propaganda. It is something which they sincerely believe. I don't think that it can be called fasad fil ard in any way. Fasad fil ard can only be something which is done deliberately, which is done knowingly. But if a person is presenting a different view, which he or she is convinced about, and it is against the teaching of the Prophet or the personality of the Prophet, I would not classify that as fasad fil ard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. That was it for all of the questions today.